Hello and welcome. It's a question we've all probably thought about at some point. What happens when a country, an entire nation, breaks a major international rule? Who holds them accountable? Well, today, we're going to dive deep into the legal framework that was built to answer that exact question. It's called state responsibility. Okay, so let's start with the heart of the problem, what you could call the accountability gap. Think about it. If you or I break the law, the system is pretty clear, right? Police, courts, they can step in. But what happens when it's an entire country? There's no global police force to knock on the door of a capital city. And that creates a huge challenge for international justice. So to really get our heads around how the world deals with this, here's how we're going to break it down. We'll start with the basic problem, then we'll define this key concept of state responsibility. After that, we'll look at the actual rule book that governs it, get into the nitty-gritty of how you prove a country is legally at fault, and then, finally, we'll talk about why this whole system is so incredibly important. Right, so how does the international community even try to fill that accountability gap we were just talking about? Well, the answer lies in a really powerful legal principle, and that principle is called state responsibility. Now, the core idea here is actually pretty fascinating. The moment a state violates an international obligation, it's like it trips a wire, and a whole new set of rules automatically kicks in. It's the legal system's way of saying, okay, an action happened, and now there has to be a reaction. It's designed to create consequences, even when there's no traditional police to enforce them. So that brings up a really important question, right? If these rules are so critical, where did they even come from? Who wrote this rule book, and what gives it any kind of authority? This quote really gets to the heart of it. Any legal system, doesn't matter if it's for people or for countries, is basically incomplete if it can't answer the question, so what happens now? The rules of state responsibility, they're the international system's best attempt to provide a clear, predictable answer to that very question. And here's where that rulebook came from. This wasn't something created overnight. Nope, it's the result of literally decades of work by top legal experts at the International Law Commission. They finalized these articles back in 2001, and the UN General Assembly then presented them to the world. But here's the really crucial part. Even though these articles aren't a formal, signed and sealed treaty, they are so widely respected and used in international courts that they're now considered to reflect customary international law. You can think of it as the unwritten but universally understood rules of the game. All right, now we get to what is probably the most complex piece of this whole puzzle. Because, it's one thing to say a rule was broken. It is a completely different thing to legally prove that an entire country is the one at fault. So the core challenge is something called attribution. How in the world do you legally connect to the actions of individual people or groups to this big, abstract idea of the state? Well, that international rulebook we mentioned provides a very specific set of tests to do just that. And here they are, the 6 key ways to legally pin an act on a state. Let's walk through these, because this is where the theory gets very real. First up, and this is the most obvious one, we have acts by the state and its organs. If a country's military, its police, any government official does something in their official capacity, boom, that's an act of the state. Simple. Second is governmental authority. This one covers groups that aren't technically part of the government, but they've been given government power. So think of a private security firm that's been hired to run a state prison. Their actions, they can be attributed to the state. Third, we have organs on loan. This one's a little niche, but still important. If one country loans an official, say a judge or a police advisor, to another country, and that official does something wrong, it's the receiving country that's on the hook. Okay, now it gets trickier. Fourth is private acts. The bar to clear this one is super high. The actions of just regular citizens are only considered acts of the state if you can prove they were acting under the state's direct instruction or control. Fifth, adopted acts. This one's fascinating. This is when private individuals do something, but then the state steps in after the fact and publicly says, yep, we approve, we're making that act our own. And finally, number 6, acts of an insurrectional movement. Basically, if a rebel group successfully overthrows a government and becomes the new government, they are then responsible for any wrongful acts they committed along the way. So after all that legal detail, let's zoom back out for a second. Why does having this really intricate system of rules and attribution matter so much on the world stage? At the end of the day, this is all about preventing chaos. This framework, yeah, it's imperfect, but it's what stands between how countries deal with each other and, well, pure anarchy. It creates a formal, predictable way for nations to handle grievances. It gives an injured state a path to seek reparations. But most importantly, it reinforces this fundamental idea that no nation is completely above the law. And that idea, that's really a cornerstone of global stability. And that brings us to our final thought. We have this whole sophisticated legal structure to assign responsibility, but like we said at the very beginning, there's often no one there to enforce the verdict. So the question that's left for all of us to think about is this. In a world of sovereign nations, is the legal declaration of responsibility all by itself a powerful enough tool for justice? Thanks for watching.